ในการบริหารธุรกิจเนี่ยมันมีปัจจัยที่จะทำให้องค์กรยั่งยืนเนี่ยที่เกี่ยวข้องเยอะมาก
เรื่องของการบริหารความเสี่ยงเรื่องของการที่เราจะต้องทำอย่างไรถึงจะดำเนินธุรกิจอย่างยั่งยืน
เรื่องของ sustainability กับเรื่องของ strategy เนี่ยมันคือเรื่องเดียวกัน
มันเป็นการเติบโตไม่ใช่เพียงแค่เศรษฐกิจแต่เป็นการสร้างสังคมที่แข็งแรงขึ้น
วันนี้ sustainability เนี่ยเป็นความท้าทายที่ให้ทั้งโอกาสนะครับแล้วก็ความเสี่ยง
คนรุ่นใหม่จำนวนมากเนี่ยเขาเริ่มมองว่าทำยังไงที่จะรอดกันยาว
ๆหลักสูตรนี้ดีมากเป็นการช่วยบอร์ดเข้ามาเป็นส่วนคิดมากในการวาง strategy
ถ้าสามารถมาร่วมในหลักสูตรแบบนี้แล้วเนี่ยผมว่าไอ้นี่คือความหวังเลย
เราได้เรียนรู้เนี่ยไม่ได้จากแค่วิทยากรเท่านั้นแต่เพื่อนๆในคลาสเองเนี่ยก็เป็นอะไรที่สุดยอดไม่น่าจะได้ไปหาเรียนได้แบบนี้ที่อื่น
รู้สึกว่าผมไม่รู้อะไรอีกตั้งเยอะในการที่จะเป็นกรรมการที่ครบถ้วนผมพบว่าทันสมัยมากขึ้นแล้วก็ตอบโจทย์หลายๆอย่าง
สิ่งแวดล้อมด้านของสังคมและก็ด้านของธรรมาภิบาลก็เป็นหัวใจสำคัญในด้านของ ESG ขณะเดียวกันก็ต้องมี Innovation เพื่อที่จะสามารถที่จะมุ่งไปข้างหน้าให้ได้อย่างมั่นคง
ทุกคุณเป็น Top Management คุณเป็น Chairman คุณเป็นกรุ๊ป CEO ต่างๆต้องมองภาพยาวธุรกิจที่เราอยู่มันอยู่ใน Direction ที่มันจะไปหรือเปล่าเทรนด์ของ Business มันจะไปหรือเปล่า
องค์กรจะอยู่เฉยไม่ได้ละดังนั้นเรื่องของตัว Innovation นะคะหรือเรื่องของ Sustain เนี่ยเป็นเรื่องที่บอร์ดกับฝ่ายจัดการควรจะต้องมาให้ความสำคัญที่ชัดเจนและเพิ่มขึ้น
ธุรกิจเนี่ยมันต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงตามสถานการณ์เพราะฉะนั้นบอร์ดที่มีความรู้ความสามารถที่จะสอดคล้องกับความต้องการธุรกิจเป็นเรื่องสำคัญ
Niche player เนี่ยมันถูก disrupt มันถูก challenge มาตลอดว่า despite ว่าคุณ short term performance คุณทำดีจะแน่ใจยังไงว่าอีกหลายปีข้างหน้าคุณจะทำได้เหมือนเดิมและทำได้ดีกว่าเดิม
การมาร่วมสัมมนาเนี่ยนะฮะก็ทำให้เราได้รับรู้นะฮะแล้วก็เห็นมุมมองต่าง
ๆเราเห็นภาพกว้างเราเห็น foresight ว่าวันนี้การเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งหลายความท้าทายทั้งนี้กำลังเข้ามา
ในการบริหารธุรกิจเนี่ยมันมีปัจจัยที่จะทำให้องค์กรยั่งยืนเนี่ยที่เกี่ยวข้องเยอะมาก
เรื่องของการบริหารความเสี่ยงเรื่องของการที่เราจะต้องทำอย่างไรถึงจะดำเนินธุรกิจอย่างยั่งยืน
เรื่องของ sustainability กับเรื่องของ strategy เนี่ยมันคือเรื่องเดียวกัน
มันเป็นการเติบโตไม่ใช่เพียงแค่เศรษฐกิจแต่เป็นการสร้างสังคมที่แข็งแรงขึ้น
วันนี้ sustainability เนี่ยเป็นความท้าทายที่ให้ทั้งโอกาสนะครับแล้วก็ความเสี่ยง
คนรุ่นใหม่จำนวนมากเนี่ยเขาเริ่มมองว่าทำยังไงที่จะรอดกันยาว
ๆหลักสูตรนี้ดีมากเป็นการช่วยบอร์ดเข้ามาเป็นส่วนคิดมากในการวาง strategy
ถ้าสามารถมาร่วมในหลักสูตรแบบนี้แล้วเนี่ยผมว่าไอ้นี่คือความหวังเลย
เราได้เรียนรู้เนี่ยไม่ได้จากแค่วิทยากรเท่านั้นแต่เพื่อนๆในคลาสเองเนี่ยก็เป็นอะไรที่สุดยอดไม่น่าจะได้ไปหาเรียนได้แบบนี้ที่อื่น
รู้สึกว่าผมไม่รู้อะไรอีกตั้งเยอะในการที่จะเป็นกรรมการที่ครบถ้วนผมพบว่าทันสมัยมากขึ้นแล้วก็ตอบโจทย์หลายๆอย่าง
สิ่งแวดล้อมด้านของสังคมและก็ด้านของธรรมาภิบาลก็เป็นหัวใจสำคัญในด้านของ ESG ขณะเดียวกันก็ต้องมี Innovation เพื่อจะสามารถที่จะมุ่งไปข้างหน้าให้ได้อย่างมั่นคง
ทุกคุณเป็น Top Management คุณเป็น Chairman คุณเป็นกรุ๊ป CEO ต่างๆต้องมองภาพยาวธุรกิจที่เราอยู่มันอยู่ใน direction ที่มันจะไปหรือเปล่าเทรนด์ของ business มันจะไปหรือเปล่า
องค์กรจะอยู่เฉยไม่ได้ละดังนั้นเรื่องของตัว innovation นะคะหรือเรื่องของ sustain เนี่ยเป็นเรื่องที่บอร์ดกับฝ่ายจัดการควรจะต้องมาให้ความสำคัญที่ชัดเจนและเพิ่มขึ้น
ธุรกิจเนี่ยมันต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงตามสถานการณ์เพราะฉะนั้นบอร์ดที่มีความรู้ความสามารถที่จะสอดคล้องกับความต้องการธุรกิจเป็นเรื่องสำคัญ
niche player เนี่ยมันถูก disrupt มันถูก challenge มาตลอดว่า despite ว่าคุณ short term performance คุณทำดีจะแน่ใจยังไงว่าอีกหลายปีข้างหน้าคุณจะทำได้เหมือนเดิมและทำได้ดีกว่าเดิม
การมาร่วมสัมมนาเนี่ยนะฮะก็ทำให้เราได้รับรู้นะฮะแล้วก็เห็นมุมมองต่าง
ๆเราเห็นภาพกว้างเราเห็น foresight ว่าวันนี้การเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งหลายความท้าทายทั้งนี้กำลังเข้ามา
ในการบริหารธุรกิจเนี่ยมันมีปัจจัยที่จะทำให้องค์กรยั่งยืนเนี่ยที่เกี่ยวข้องเยอะมาก
เรื่องของการบริหารความเสี่ยงเรื่องของการที่เราจะต้องทำอย่างไรถึงจะดำเนินธุรกิจอย่างยั่งยืน
เรื่องของ sustainability กับเรื่องของ strategy เนี่ยมันคือเรื่องเดียวกัน
มันเป็นการเติบโตไม่ใช่เพียงแค่เศรษฐกิจแต่เป็นการสร้างสังคมที่แข็งแรงขึ้น
วันนี้ sustainability เนี่ยเป็นความท้าทายที่ให้ทั้งโอกาสนะครับแล้วก็ความเสี่ยง
คนรุ่นใหม่จำนวนมากเนี่ยเขาเริ่มมองว่าทำยังไงที่จะรอดกันยาว
ๆหลักสูตรนี้ดีมากเป็นการช่วยบอร์ดเข้ามาเป็นส่วนคิดมากในการวาง strategy
ถ้าสามารถมาร่วมในหลักสูตรแบบนี้แล้วเนี่ยผมว่าไอ้นี่คือความหวังเลย
เราได้เรียนรู้เนี่ยไม่ได้จากแค่วิทยากรเท่านั้นแต่เพื่อนๆในคลาสเองเนี่ยก็เป็นอะไรที่สุดยอดไม่น่าจะได้ไปหาเรียนได้แบบนี้ที่อื่น
รู้สึกว่าผมไม่รู้อะไรอีกตั้งเยอะในการที่จะเป็นกรรมการที่ครบถ้วนผมพบว่าทันสมัยมากขึ้นแล้วก็ตอบโจทย์หลายๆอย่าง
สิ่งแวดล้อมด้านของสังคมและก็ด้านของธรรมาภิบาลก็เป็นหัวใจสำคัญด้านของ ESG ขณะเดียวกันก็ต้องมี Innovation เพื่อที่จะสามารถที่จะมุ่งไปข้างหน้าให้ได้อย่างมั่นคง
ทุกคุณเป็น Top Management คุณเป็น Chairman คุณเป็นกรุ๊ป CEO ต่างๆต้องมองภาพยาวธุรกิจที่เราอยู่มันอยู่ใน direction ที่มันจะไปหรือเปล่าเทรนด์ของ business มันจะไปหรือเปล่า
องค์กรจะอยู่เฉยไม่ได้ละดังนั้นเรื่องของตัว innovation นะคะหรือเรื่องของ sustain เนี่ยเป็นเรื่องที่บอร์ดกับฝ่ายจัดการควรจะต้องมาให้ความสำคัญที่ชัดเจนและเพิ่มขึ้น
ธุรกิจเนี่ยมันต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงตามสถานการณ์เพราะฉะนั้นบอร์ดที่มีความรู้ความสามารถที่จะสอดคล้องกับความต้องการธุรกิจเป็นเรื่องสำคัญ
niche player เนี่ยมันถูก disrupt มันถูก challenge มาตลอดว่า despite ว่าคุณ short term performance คุณทำดีจะแน่ใจยังไงว่าอีกหลายปีข้างหน้าคุณจะทำได้เหมือนเดิมและทำได้ดีกว่าเดิม
การมาร่วมสัมมนาเนี่ยนะฮะก็ทำให้เราได้รับรู้นะฮะแล้วก็เห็นมุมมองต่าง
ๆเราเห็นภาพกว้างเราเห็น foresight ว่าวันนี้การเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งหลายความท้าทายทั้งนี้กำลังเข้ามา
บริหารธุรกิจเนี่ยมันมีปัจจัยที่จะทำให้องค์กรยั่งยืนเนี่ยที่เกี่ยวข้องเยอะมาก
เรื่องของการบริหารความเสี่ยงเรื่องของการที่เราจะต้องทำอย่างไรถึงจะดำเนินธุรกิจอย่างยั่งยืน
เรื่องของ sustainability กับเรื่องของ strategy เนี่ยมันคือเรื่องเดียวกัน
มันเป็นการเติบโตไม่ใช่เพียงแค่เศรษฐกิจแต่เป็นการสร้างสังคมที่แข็งแรงขึ้น
วันนี้ sustainability เนี่ยเป็นความท้าทายที่ให้ทั้งโอกาสนะครับแล้วก็ความเสี่ยง
คนรุ่นใหม่จำนวนมากเนี่ยเขาเริ่มมองว่าทำยังไงที่จะรอดกันยาว
ๆหลักสูตรนี้ดีมากเป็นการช่วยบอร์ดเข้ามาเป็นส่วนคิดมากๆในการวาง strategy
ถ้าสามารถมาร่วมในหลักสูตรแบบนี้แล้วเนี่ยผมว่าไอ้นี่คือความหวังเลย
เราได้เรียนรู้เนี่ยไม่ได้จากแค่วิทยากรเท่านั้นแต่เพื่อนๆในคลาสเองเนี่ยก็เป็นอะไรที่สุดยอดไม่น่าจะได้ไปหาเรียนได้แบบนี้ที่อื่น
รู้สึกว่าผมไม่รู้อะไรอีกตั้งเยอะในการที่จะเป็นกรรมการที่ครบถ้วนผมพบว่าทันสมัยมากขึ้นแล้วก็ตอบโจทย์หลายๆอย่าง
สิ่งแวดล้อมด้านของสังคมและก็ด้านของธรรมาภิบาลก็เป็นหัวใจสำคัญด้านของ ESG ขณะเดียวกันก็ต้องมี Innovation เพื่อที่จะสามารถที่จะมุ่งไปข้างหน้าให้ได้อย่างมั่นคง
ทุกคุณเป็น Top Management คุณเป็น Chairman คุณเป็นกรุ๊ป CEO ต่างๆต้องมองภาพยาวธุรกิจที่เราอยู่มันอยู่ใน direction ที่มันจะไปหรือเปล่าเทรนด์ของ business มันจะไปหรือเปล่า
องค์กรจะอยู่เฉยไม่ได้ละดังนั้นเรื่องของตัว innovation นะคะหรือเรื่องของ sustain เนี่ยเป็นเรื่องที่บอร์ดกับฝ่ายจัดการควรจะต้องมาให้ความสำคัญที่ชัดเจนและเพิ่มขึ้น
ธุรกิจเนี่ยมันต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงตามสถานการณ์เพราะฉะนั้นบอร์ดที่มีความรู้ความสามารถที่จะสอดคล้องกับความต้องการธุรกิจเป็นเรื่องสำคัญ
niche player เนี่ยมันถูก disrupt มันถูก challenge มาตลอดว่า despite ว่าคุณ short term performance คุณทำดีจะแน่ใจยังไงว่าอีกหลายปีข้างหน้าคุณจะทำได้เหมือนเดิมและทำได้ดีกว่าเดิม
การมาร่วมสัมมนาเนี่ยนะฮะก็ทำให้เราได้รับรู้นะฮะแล้วก็เห็นมุมมองต่าง
ๆเราเห็นภาพกว้างเราเห็น foresight ว่าวันนี้การเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งหลายความท้าทายทั้งนี้กำลังเข้ามา
สวัสดีครับ ผมกุลเวช เจนวัฒนาวิทย์ CEO ของ IOD. I will have to speak in English today, even though the format of our conference will be in Thai most of the time. My name is Kulvech Janvatanavit, the CEO of Thai IOD, and welcome to National Director Conference 2021. For this year, it's going to be different. Work from home, COVID, and so this is an online, obviously. This year, the conference will be based on the theme Leadership Behind Closed Door, and it will be spread for almost 3 months. Okay, because the reason why we spread it almost 3 months is because instead of inviting members to come and enjoy one whole day of presentation, why not make it bite-sized and maximize the benefit that you can enjoy. So we will have session that start from today until the mid of October. It will be divided into this week, which is the Israel, the Innovation Week. And then after that, 8 weeks of Thai sessions. Of the speaker might be English speakers, but we'll run it in Thai. So without any further ado, I would like to talk about this session itself, which is about innovative disruption. I would like to invite Mr. Dagan Aloni, Israel Economic Counsellor to Thailand. But before I do that, I have to announce that you are all going to be in mute. And if you have any question, please feel free to type into the all panelists, and we'll make sure that your question will be answered. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Dagan Aloni. Sawadee krab. Hello, Kun Dagan.
Sawadee krab. Hello, everyone. Hello to IOD members.
Hi.
Kulvech.
Hi. Hi. Last time, the first we talked to each other was about 2 years ago when we tried to plan for Thai IOD member to join the trip, the real trip to Israel for innovation. That never happened because of COVID. But anyway, this is even better.
Yes, I agree. 2 years later, we're doing the same, but online.
Exactly what we call innovative disruption. Then let's disrupt the virus. Okay. So without any further ado, please, Kun Dagan, please tell us a little bit about Israel Economic Counsellor to Thailand, and also about the next speaker.
Okay, first of all, I think it's very important for me to thank you, Kun Kulvech, and the IOD, quite an amazing team for this great event and our great collaboration. I'm actually kind of excited for the 2 days we have in front of us. It should be very, very intellectual and very fruitful, I think, for everyone. Maybe I just have a quick introduction about myself. I know many people on the audience. I can see in the participant list, I know many names here, which are good friends. But for those of you who doesn't know me, my name is Dagan. I am the Israeli Economic Counsellor to Thailand. My office mission is to try to strengthen the collaboration between Israel and Thailand organization. We believe that actually no country and no company can maintain growth alone, can develop alone without good friends and good partnership. So we try to help the private sectors, both in Thailand and in Israel, to find the relevant technologies and the relevant partners. We work today, I think, with most of the large organizations in Thailand, and to understand if this kind of partnership can be fruitful and can be formed from both sides. because we're a government entity and we are not a commercial entity, it helps us to be neutral. And I believe that this kind of event, Kulvech, as you said, are very useful and very important, especially in these kind of times, to learn from one another, because there's a lot to learn from Thailand and the business sector there, and maybe we can join forces in a later stage. So as you asked, Kulvech, we worked very hard to bring relevant content to our audience today and on Thursday, on the 19th, which we are going to have. I can tell you that these two sessions will not be a regular general innovation presentation. I'm sure many of the people in the audience have heard regular innovation presentation, but we will try to show actual use cases of big companies, conglomerates, and they are facing the same challenges that board of directors in any company today face. How do you add value to your customer, to your product? How do you actually inject innovation to a big organization? So today we will hear from, for example, from the head of global innovation of Procter & Gamble. They are trying to do this from a base in Israel. You, Kulvech, will be speaking with Professor Menipaz, who spends the last few decades working with directors and researching the motivation and the challenges of directors towards innovation, but also toward risk, which is very important. On Thursday, we will have the largest venture capital in Israel in a panel with SCB, discussing how should we approach tech investments in these very challenging times. We will also have a great panel with the great people behind the innovation of Thai Union, Strauss, which is the biggest food and beverages company in Israel. So as I said, actual and live example, this is what we will try to do. So I believe that our audience will be able to leave with some useful insights and what to do about what they can do next in their own companies and organization. If we can give a hint about what should have to come, I'll be very, very happy and pleased. So I encourage everyone to participate, ask questions, and most important, to have a bit fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so hey, all, how are you?
Hello, I'm great. How are you?
I am fine, thank you. So as we discussed before, and I promised to, in the beginning, not to make it a general innovation discussion, but before we learn about the Procter & Gamble experience with yourself, I would like to take 2 minutes to give just a short, let's say, framework and introduction to the ecosystem in Israel, for those who are in the audience that are a bit less familiar. So let me just share quickly my screen. Okay, so for those of you who doesn't know Israel, we are a small country, you can see, just in the middle of a lovely neighborhood between Syria and Egypt. We are a very small country, 9 million population. This is less than the population of Bangkok. And if you're wondering, okay, how small it is, then Thailand is 25 times bigger than Israel. This is how we would look if we were a little region in Thailand. So, but for several years, Israel has been able to rank herself as a global leader in research and innovation, just above great countries like the US, Japan, and Singapore. This actually led to today approximately 8,000 startups in Israel, in a country of 9 million people, remember? And today, if you know what a unicorn is a startup that is valued above $1 billion. More or less 10% of all the global unicorns are born in Israel one way or another. Now, I can assure you that nobody in Israel is smarter than anyone. We are regular people, but it's one of the outcome of investing quite a lot in research and development. So Israel has been investing quite a lot of the portion of R&D from our GDP. So this is, as you see here, mostly private sector R&D and not governmental. So this R&D expenditure actually serves us to do well. And this R&D also attracts many big companies to Israel. Today, there are more or less 400 multinational corporations working in Israel. I'm sure everybody can recognize most of the name. Most of them have R&D centers in Israel. Google, for example, developing part of its AI technology in Tel Aviv, and Amazon developing a part of Alexa, etc. Now, opening an operation center like this, in order to import innovation to the company, what we called open innovation, is a known business model. And this is why I'm very happy to have you, Or, today with me, because you lead the, as you say, I put Procter & Gamble somewhere in 2007 there. I hope I was correct. But you lead the global innovation efforts of Procter & Gamble from your base in Israel. And I ask you if you can help me to take through the process of innovation, when in my eyes, the main challenge is how do you do it with a big and quite an old company like Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble has been around for 130 years, if I'm not mistaken. So how—
180.
180, you see, I even took it down a bit. So how do you, if you're based in Israel, try to influence the innovative processes inside just such a big company? I'll let you take it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dagan, and thank you, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. Sawadika. So as Mr. Dagan mentioned, I'm Director of Global Technology Innovation. I'm part of the Global Innovation team at Procter & Gamble. I'm also part of Israel Directors Union. And yes, I'm based in Israel, and there's a reason why I'm based in Israel. Just like Mr. Dagan showed, there's a great talent and a great resource of startups here in Israel, and we at P&G we want to leverage that. So let me maybe share a few slides, just very quickly. Maybe before that. So I'll give you maybe a bit of a background about P&G. I assume you all know P&G, so I'll do it very, very quickly. So Procter & Gamble, you know, we have 100,000 employees all over the world. We serve 5 billion consumers all over the world. We operate in more than 70 countries, and we sell in more than 180 countries. Now, maybe the numbers, you know, seem a bit unfamiliar, but maybe this slide would be more familiar to you with some of our brands. So as you know, Procter & Gamble is a company of brands. But the key question for us is, will all of those brands, all of those billion-dollar brands, will they survive? And as you probably know, we face a lot of competition, which is great. Competition is a great thing, but we at P&G, we face a lot of competition from startups and from other companies, and we need to see how we can basically cope with that, and what do we need to do in order to survive. So maybe a bit of a background about ourselves. So Procter & Gamble actually started as a startup by its own. So you see here Mr. Procter and Mr. Gamble. Please don't ask me to name you who is who. But basically, we started as a startup company, a company that sold soaps and candles, and gradually grew and acquired more startups and developed more products, and gradually grew to what we all know today as P&G. And we see innovation really as part of our core. That picture was taken at the last CES, at the last physical CES, so 2020, January 2020. You see here a huge booth of P&G at, you know, the largest consumer electronics show, the largest innovation conference, one would argue. And that's because we really understand that in order for us, you know, to thrive, we need to collaborate with the innovation ecosystem. We need to collaborate with startups. We embrace the open innovation.
Now, Kunor, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. If you can speak a bit louder, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
People in the chat saying that they. Thank you, and sorry.
Oh, sorry for that. Sure, I'll raise my voice. So obviously, there's a lot of internal innovation at P&G. You know, we always create new brands, etc. But there is also a lot of open innovation or external innovation where we collaborate with startups. And I'll just show you here some of the examples. So we have, you know, in our oral care power brush, we have a app that basically, you know, scans the way that you brush your teeth, provides your recommendations, etc. We have an app that's called the Skin Advisor, part of the Olay brand, that actually scans your skin and tells you, you know, specific areas where you need more treatment, etc. We also have a lot of innovation in the worlds of sustainability. So we're thinking of new business models and new ways to you know, better treat our planet and to decrease our plastic usage, etc. So you see here some examples of products which are much healthier to the environment. We also came up with a product that's called EC30 that basically takes 70% less of the space, 80% less weight. It's basically a small tube that you receive. It's without the entire package. We realized basically that the largest ingredient of our products is, you know, is fluids, and fluids is something that we all have in our homes. We all have water in our kitchen or in our bathroom, etc. So this is a small tab, just this size, that you can place under your tap, and you receive the same product. You receive Fairy or Tide or Ariel or Pantene Pro V, etc. So this is part of our, I would say, some of the examples of what we do. And let me share with you a bit of our numbers. So our startup innovation numbers. So we received more than 100 requests or projects from business units at P&G all over the world. We work with all our major 10 categories, and we have 14 global innovation outposts, like the one that we have in Israel that I'm part of. So we have more outposts in other regions, and we have evaluated more than 6,000 startups in the past 3 years, and completed 45 pilots out of those 100 projects. Now, I don't like to brag, but in the industry, 45 completed pilots out of 100 projects, that's a relatively high number. And out of those 45 pilots that were completed, 29% or 15 startups eventually scaled and became a global solution or a global vendor of P&G. I
would like to stop you here, or this is sorry for again to interrupt, but this is quite an amazing number, and I'm very curious. The 29% of pilots have scaled. I'm thinking out loud, 71% of pilots failed. Okay.
Right.
I'm really curious. How does your management, how does the board of directors actually conceive this kind of number? Okay, we are going to scale up innovation, but 71% of everything we will do will fail. Explain to me a bit, how does your management see this?
Sure, and that's a great question. So basically, we need to remember that, you know, startups in generally, their success rate is about 1%, right? So 99% of startups fail. That's to begin with. Now we are in approach of fail fast or learn, right? So it's okay to fail, and we embrace the failure. We know that it's part of the process. And for us, actually, even if the number was only 2%, that would still create an impact, because 2%, that means only, you know, one startup or of the 45 pilots that we manage. If just one of those startups would scale and become a global vendor from P&G, that makes a huge impact on a global scale. So reaching 29 is actually exceeding our expectations. Hopefully that answered your question. I would like to share a bit about our process. So what do we do? So we start with a business unit requirement. So the business units come to us with a need, with something that they have to solve. And we, at that point, come back to them and say, hey, we would love to help, challenge accepted, but you need to answer 3 prerequisites. The first, we want this requirement to come from the VP of the business unit. And why is that? Because we want them to look at it as a must-have versus a nice-to-have. We want to see their commitment. The second prerequisite is budget for the sake of the POC, the proof of concept. It's not tens of millions of dollars, right? It's usually tens of thousands of dollars, something which is bearable. And the third prerequisite is human resource. So we want someone from the business unit to be the project leader. Because we recognize that the most important thing for the entrepreneurs is their time. And we cannot accept a situation where the corporate guy, where the entrepreneur needs to chase the corporate guy, and the corporate guy only answers the entrepreneur's email once in 3 weeks, right? So this is something we cannot accept. We then go and we have a brainstorming session with the business unit. And the outcome of that brainstorming is an innovation brief, what we call a one-pager innovation one-pager, that basically describes the problem, gives the background, says what we're looking for, also what we're not looking for, just to focus a bit the ecosystem. Then we share it with the innovation, with our 14 innovation outposts. Each of them shares it with the local ecosystem, so VCs, accelerators, etc. And then each of those VCs shares those innovation briefs with the startups. The startups then submit, and then we start the due diligence process. So what are our initial assessment questions? What are we actually asking the startups to submit? So the first one is, who referred you to this brief? So in case you would like to contact them. The second is, have they had any previous P&G engagements? Because P&G is such a large company, we sometimes don't know of different initiatives in different parts of the world. So we want to make sure this is covered. We want to understand how much did the startup raise, and obviously, short description of the company and short description of how they can solve the brief. Who assess the startups? So we have 4 people assessing those startups. First of all is the business unit representative, obviously, probably the most important one to basically decide whether the solution is interesting or not. The other part is the finance or business experts. That usually would be me. So I'm actually an accountant, so I do the business due diligence, the financial due diligence. We then have a tax expert per vertical, so we'll bring experts from blockchain or from Industry 4.0 or from cybersecurity, and we also have our head of innovation. So these are the people making the assessment. And what are we looking for, basically? So there are 3 main areas that we assess. The first one is business viability. I won't go over the entire list, but just in general, we try to understand how strong they are and if there is any risk that they would cease to exist in 6 months from now, right? So we obviously the processes are long, so we want to make sure the startup will survive. We have a lot of solution viability questions, like, will it meet the needs of the business unit? Is the solution acceptable from regulatory perspective? Can it be measured in a way that we can really see the KPIs that are met, etc. And also from a feasibility standpoint, we would like to understand whether the solution is unique, whether there are competition or competitors that provide the same solution, etc. So this is in a nutshell the things that we are looking for. We're basically creating a scorecard for each of those startups, with details, maybe some dry details, but then pros and cons of each startup, and really give a score to each of the startup. And at the end of the day, it's the business unit's decision whether they want to proceed or not. So hopefully this was clear. Let me know if there were any questions so far. Okay, so assuming there aren't, I want to speak about things that we as corporate, and I think this is relevant to the entire audience here. What are the things that we should consider when working with startups? So the first of all, we need to understand that for startups, working with corporates is a bit like dancing with elephants. It could be very, very exciting and an amazing experience, but also a bit frightening, because if you make the wrong move, the corporate or the elephant could simply crush you. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to be very, very gentle and be aware that the startup is taking a huge risk working with a corporate. The other thing is to make sure that we have the right people within our organization. So there are many people, and it's human nature, right? It's human nature to prefer the status quo and to shy away from changes. So we want to make sure that we have the right people and the right organizational structure to embrace change and to embrace innovation. The other thing is to make sure that the startup answers what we need and not what we want. Because if they only answer what we want, that means it would take a very long time to implement their solution. But if they answer something that we need, that we must have yesterday, that would impact everything, and that would make things both for us and for the startup a lot easier in terms of the engagement. The other thing is, and then maybe correlates with the organizational chart, is making sure that the business unit is open to change and is open to digital transformation. And one more thing is point of difference. So we want to make sure that we focus on the startup, and also the startup focus on its point of difference. No startup can provide everything. And sometimes startups, because they want to work with big corporates, they would say yes to everything. Can you do that? Yes, sure. Can you do that? Yes, absolutely. No, we actually prefer them to focus on what they do best. If I hear an entrepreneur or a startup tells me yes on everything that I ask, that's a bit of a red flag for me. I would prefer the startup to say, sorry, we focus only on that. That's what we do best. So we prefer to keep that direction.
Or can I maybe ask a quick question with your permission?
Yes.
You said that in the end of the day, in your way of Procter & Gamble of doing innovation, the BU make the decision. And then you have to make sure that the BU are aligned with the prospect of the organization, that they actually open for innovation from the outside. But sure that not one time you find a BU that doesn't. So is there a way that sometimes that the high management have to get involved, and I don't know if force on the BU, or because sometimes I'll give you an example from Thailand. Many times in Thailand there's a corporate venture capital that's being raised, and the corporate venture capital invests in technology, but then have to go to the BU, and many times we see the pushback from the BU. How do you deal with it in Procter & Gamble?
Absolutely. So first of all, maybe let me start with that. Without senior leadership sponsorship, this would never happen. So all of our leadership, our board of directors, our CEO, the entire C-level, are fully supportive and they fully understand the importance of innovation and of the process. And also when I'm saying BU, I mean the leadership of the business unit. So the head of the business unit. That's why we ask one of the first prerequisites that we ask is the VP approval, that yes, they want this project, they want us to find a solution. If we don't have the VP sponsorship from the business unit, we will not continue. And I can tell you that across the board, all of our business units are very much engaged, and we see huge support from all of our leadership, absolutely. And without it, you're right, it would never happen. So hopefully that answered your question. Going back to the slide, so for a startup, working with a corporate is a bit like entering a forest. Why is that? Because you know the position where you enter the forest. You know the time that you entered the forest. But once you're inside the forest, you have no idea from where you will exit, and you have no idea when will it happen. So it's understanding that working with corporates, it's a journey. And we as a corporate need to understand, you know, the fears, the challenges that the startup have. We need to see that from their point of view. And I think once we do that, things get easier, and we try to communicate a lot. There's so much that depends on, you know, setting expectations and explaining the startups each phase of the way where we stand and what are the next steps, etc. One more thing is for the startups actually to understand that there are a lot more benefits for working with startups than just, you know, dollars or just money as a payment for the POC. Startup can get so much more. They can get feedback. They can get market validation. They can get exposure to senior leadership at our company. They can get access to big data. There are so many things that are probably worthwhile a lot more to the startups versus just the payment for the POC. So that's something that we always try to communicate, because in many cases I've seen many startups that are really trying to earn money or to make profit just from the POC, just from the proof of concept. And I usually tell them, you definitely shouldn't lose when doing the POC with us, but you also shouldn't earn money. I mean, you can earn money when the solution is scaled down the road, but at the stage of the POC, don't charge too much because you're getting so much more than that. So you want the business unit, if you want the business unit to implement your solution or even to test you, you should not be too costly. And maybe the last thing is understanding that there are many different ways of success or to define success. So success is not always, you know, reaching the top of the mountain. It could also sometimes be just the journey itself, and, you know, just working with the startup, even if they don't become a global vendor of ours, it was still a very successful journey, right? Because they got a lot of feedbacks and a lot of market validation. And maybe the last thing before I wrap up is understanding that we're talking about different timings. You know, there's a joke. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a joke because it's not that funny. But you know, when startups and corporates finish their meetings, so someone would say, "All right, when would be our next meeting?" The corporate guy would open the calendar, while the entrepreneur would look at his watch. Right, so we are in a completely different stage or a completely different mindset. So that's another thing that we need to understand. So I hope that was helpful and clear. I'm here for any question.
If there are any questions, you can kindly type it on the Q&A box. But first of all, I would like, see, we already have a first one. Thank you very much, Kunkosit. What is the question is, what is Procter & Gamble's PVI policy, either product or products? And what is Procter & Gamble experience the cultural shifts on innovation path? And do you have any IP issues with startups? I can return one by one. The first one should be the PVI policy of Procter & Gamble.
Yeah, so I assume that that what you meant is the privacy policy. So we take into consideration, that's one of the most important parts for us is privacy, and we comply with all the different regulations in the US, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere according to the specific requirements. We always sign a CDA or a NDA with a startup, so we know that we have to be extremely fair with the startups regarding their trading, their secrets, etc. So if we act in a non-perfect way with just one startup, that would impact our reputation all over the world. So we cannot allow that. So we really work precisely by the book. And with IP, it very much depends on what we're doing with a startup. So usually what we prefer to do is the startup keeps their IP, we keep our IP. Only if there's a joint collaboration, we then start discussions of the IP, but that's very specific to it's different from each use case.
Actually, the second question that 𝐂𝐭𝐤𝐴 raised, it's quite interesting. If you can, in 2 minutes, he asked if there's actually a cultural shift in Procter & Gamble once you enter into the innovation path.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that we definitely have, and the short answer is yes, but we definitely have an innovation culture. I've heard recently that there are no organizational cultural changes, right? You cannot just change an organization culture. You can change organization's behavior, organization actions, and those basically define the culture. So if we do innovation, if we embrace innovation, if we work with startups, that would eventually, shift our culture. So you cannot just say, hey, right now our culture is innovation. You need to do it. You need to walk the talk.
I see that 𝐂𝐿𝐵, have you ever raised your hand?
Hi. Yes. Thank you very much. Your sites was very helpful, and I read somewhere 15 years ago. It was so good that I still remember that about P&G. And they say that P&G has this innovation philosophy, which is called proudly elsewhere. And it's amazing that after those 15 years, I almost forgot the article. But what you're saying resonates with that. Because at the time, 15 years ago, P&G already announced innovation cannot be homegrown only. They have to be working up startup. At the time, 15 years ago, no one understands startup. So it means that the board of directors did not do this by chance or by luck. They have planned on this. So can you tell us a little bit about how the board and the executive make this happen? And this probably link to the next session, which is Professor Ehud's talking about governing the innovation too.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe I would leave most of the answer to Professor Ehud Menipaz, but I would just shortly say that they're basically KPIs. Once the leadership understand that we need also external innovation or open innovation, we also need to measure it, right? Because if you don't measure it, you can't succeed, right? You don't know if it's successful or not. So the first thing was to actually measure it, and to basically incentivize people and organizations to drive innovation. I think that was probably one of the key aspects. I see some other questions. I probably won't have time to answer all of them, but maybe just very, very briefly.
I see that, yeah.
Sorry?
You're already reading. Okay, please, sorry.
Yes. So I think P&G Israel is part of the innovation activities of P&G. It's not the only one. So it's one of our innovation outposts. We have innovation outposts in other markets as well. So, Silicon Valley, London, Berlin, etc. Obviously, because of all the startups in Israel, we also decided that we need to have some sort of a presence here as well. Regarding the IP, so we barely make equity investment. It's more about partnerships. So the startups get to keep their IP. We basically become a client of those startups. So that's in a nutshell.
Okay, I see that we don't have more questions from now, but anyone from the audience who wish to contact or later, please, you can have our contact as well. We are based in Bangkok, so please feel free, and any conversation can be afterwards. This was quite interesting. I feel that we actually drilled down a bit about, how do you get your hands dirty, and less about the vision as a whole, and I thank you for this. This is very interesting, and I would like to pass on to 𝐶𝐤𝐿 that for his session with Professor Ehud. So, or as they say in Thailand, Kap on Kap, and thank you.
Many thanks, Kun Dagan, and many thanks, Kun Or. And the next session will be about innovation, but from the board's point of view. Very lucky to have Professor Ehud, Menipaz, Israel Directors Union Chairman, AEAI. So, Sawadee Krab, Professor Ehud.
Thank you very much, Colin. Can you hear me well?
Firstly, did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, you did an excellent job. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Professor Ehud, before we start, you might want to explain about your role and how close you are with the community of directors, corporate directors in Israel. Like me, I am the CEO of Thai IOD. So what is it? What's your relationship with those?
Thank you for your question, Colin. Let me clarify that. We have an excellent CEO, which I believe you have met already, and good administrators that run this whole operation. My particular role is the chairman of the advisory board of the Israeli Directors Union and the chairman of the international board.
Wow.
In a way of directors, we basically the only institute in Israel that represents directors both for public and private corporations.
Okay, so you are the gatekeeper of all the knowledge of corporate governance when it comes to innovation, because that is what Israel is known for. So let me not waste your time and go to the the question, which is we heard all talking about Procter and Gamble and the what they announced many years ago, proudly elsewhere, which means that P&G has to work with others to innovate things. With that, my first question is that P&G probably have to imagine that it cannot work alone, but it's part of the whole ecosystem. So can you Thai business community understand that what does it mean for Thai business people to work with the larger ecosystem of technology, and has it happened already? Can you give us some example?
Thank you. I wonder if I can start by just saying that I had the possibility and opportunity to visit your country several times. I also had my youngest son celebrate his honeymoon in Thailand just a few years ago. And so I think very highly of your developing country, and I'm a little bit aware of what is going on in Thailand. So whatever perspective I'm going to give you now would be based on observing Thailand for about 20 years, as I do for many other countries, but obviously today we'll focus on Thailand and compare it, if we can do that, to Israel. If I can relate to the presentation we just heard from Orr and Procter & Gamble, Colin, I find it very interesting to look back on Procter & Gamble from the governance point of view, things that maybe Orr, who may be a little bit younger than me, may not even remember or know. Here is Procter & Gamble. Do you know Procter & Gamble world headquarters is not in New York, and is not in Chicago, and is not in Los Angeles, and not in London. Do you know where the headquarters, world headquarters for Procter & Gamble is?
Yeah, it was like in the middle of nowhere. It's like Minnesota. I cannot remember. Or
not Minnesota. Let me help you. Let me help you. Procter & Gamble
sure.
has started up, still headquarters, is in Cincinnati, just north of Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Now, as you said, rightly so, this is not the center of the world for innovation. This is not the center of the world for finance. This is not the center of the world for knowledge workers. And the interesting thing is that even you were stuck, as Procter & Gamble was, in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. They managed to conquer the world with the innovation drive. But now you ask yourself, where was the knowledge of Procter & Gamble, which is definitely an innovative corporation, especially in a very difficult area of detergents and food, et cetera, consumer products. This whole knowledge was created not within the quarters of the company. Actually, the innovation laboratories were stuck far away from where the headquarters are, in the general area of Ohio State, but far away from where the usual people come. The board of directors decided that innovation would be done in what we call today a greenhouse, far away from the main production plants. Now, things have changed since then. The ecosystem today for innovation requires an open system intertwined with daily life of the corporation. And if there is a first recommendation I'm going to suggest today, is that do not separate between the innovative people or the innovation unit and the main day-to-day operation of the corporation. We've seen it with 3M, we've seen it with General Electric, we've seen it obviously with Microsoft, etc., etc. I'd like to relate for a minute to the ecosystem in itself and look at its components, if I may, Colin. And for that, I'm going to ask you to share my screen. If I may ask you please to let me do that. Let me see if it works. Can you see my screen?
I do. We do. We can see your screen, but it's on the. Oh, okay. It's a PowerPoint presentation. Right?
If you can see my screen, you should see now an ecosystem of innovation, which I'd like to guide you through for the coming 60 seconds or so.
Sure.
On the left-hand side, you'll see what I call a national ecosystem for innovation. And right next to it is the corporate ecosystem for innovation. Each one of them consists of several components, which I'm going to show in a minute. But before that, I'd like to call your attention to the right-hand side, where I present 6 elements of corporate governance that lend themselves to innovation. And this particular corporate governance actions or strategy is intervened by what I call social values of each one of our board of directors and employees and executives in individual attributes. I'm going to point out to those 2 elements because they become a major determinant in the rate and success of innovation for nations, for Thailand, for Israel, for the United States, for Malaysia, for Indonesia, for the Philippines. All these countries I visit every year for the last 20 so years. And the insights are very important. Let me look at some of those particular very important variables that affect the ecosystem. On the national ecosystem, we look at several of these items. There are 13 of them. I'm not going to explain each one of them, but I'd like to point out some that are maybe more important than others. Let's relate to the social and cultural norms. When we are directors and the board of directors, we are part of a national system. We are brought up by our parents, grandparents. We cherish our family norms and values. And in one way or another, it affects our tendency to innovate, going to new ventures, or talked about Israel as being a place, and I think Dagan mentioned that as well, Israel being a startup nation, because there are relatively an intense number of innovators and engineers that, that help us become more innovative than others. But let's look at the reasons for that. Here's, for example, my view of Thailand for the last 20 years versus Israel regarding cultural and social norms on innovation. The green line at the bottom here is the Thai, measured Thai cultural and social norms relating to innovation. And on top is the Israeli one in blue, in colored blue. You'll see that there is quite a gap between what is being measured in Thailand and in Israel regarding cultural and social norms. Obviously, each one of our listeners and audience right now can attest better than me But I can tell you that this particular observation is statistically sound. I share this information incidentally with the United Nations, with the World Bank, with OECD, with President Putin, with Prime Minister Trudeau. And this particular observation tells us there are things to do in order to improve the innovation ecosystem in Thailand. And I'm not saying Israel is the best, but I'm saying there is a gap here that we can attend to. There's another interesting insight I can provide in here. Fear of failure. There are directors in the board of directors that hate to fail. We just heard from Orr the number of failed attempts to innovate. This is rather and very much a characteristic of a culture, of the environment you brought up in. And so an interesting thing is about Thailand fear of failure. And you can see that this is an index which I'm not going to go into, but just to tell you that the last 20 years, in a way of fear of failure, there's really not much of a change in Thailand, maybe a little bit of an increase in the fear of failure. The idea is basically, if you have something to lose, you are not going to innovate. Many of us, naturally speaking, don't like to fail. And obviously,
Professor Ehud,
yeah, yes, please.
One thing, how come it looks cyclical to me? The failure rate.
It's a good question. I have to ask you, for example, what happened in 2011 or what happened in 2017 that make it a bit of an extreme point here. Now that's for the second screen. That's for more explanation. I can possibly ask you what happened in the way of economy for Thailand at the time. I'm not sure, but I'm just saying this explanation should be made, and I do have a second screen, and I can explain it possibly. But you have to think about the economy as
so if the index is lower, it means less fear, right?
That's correct.
Maybe, you know, before 2002, there was Tom Yam Goong crisis. So at the time, you know, people just got out of the crisis and they're like, okay, I have nothing much else to lose. So the index of fear is low. So
yeah, that could be
is it possible that every time we gain something and we become successful, we are risk averse?
Yes. Can I point out to you another thing which is very interesting? We refer to an activity which we call entrepreneurial employee activity, which is basically talking about innovation efforts within the corporation as opposed to startups. If you follow the green line at the very bottom here, this is the percentage of people in a Thai corporation, larger corporation, that tend to innovate. And we can see that we are talking about anywhere, we didn't measure it before 2011, so we started to measure it 2011 onwards, and you can see that we are talking about possibly 2% to say 5% of the people that we can say innovate within larger corporations. If you think, and now I'm calling on each one of our audience right now, if you think about your own organization, how many people in your organization you can claim are indeed innovators? Those people that wake up in the morning and they say, I've got a great idea. I need to talk to my peers, my directors, my boss about this new idea. And when my boss tells me, please don't waste my time, I insist to pursue this new idea. How many in your organization? 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20? By my measurements of Thailand, we are talking about no more than 1 to 5 people in a larger corporation that you can call innovators. Now, if I can just reflect on one more thing, when we look into other countries, for example, Israel, the rate is about 3 times to 4 times as much. In other words, we also have something to vie for, okay? But I think also Thailand can do same. So let me just finish off with one more thing. We know that when we innovate, taxes, for example, is a consideration. In Israel, for example, we find a way to help innovators with one rule, shall we say. And the rule says that if I commit to give money to some venture, I don't give the money, but I commit myself. I can ask for a complete write-off first year, which will be benefit to the one that provides the funds. The government loses some money, obviously, in this context, but you can do some tax rules. We can make some tax rules that would change the innovation ecosystem. And one last thing, R&D. Look at the Thailand R&D transfer rate. It's marked down in the orange line at the bottom here. R&D transfer, the way I see it, has not changed much in Thailand over the last 10, 15 years. You ask yourself, how come there is no new IP that the corporations may use? You've got a very large industrialized economic center, very large. And you know what? Even in the area of tourism, right? And you ask yourself, how much of R&D, how much of IP is being developed and transferred, commercialized? And you can see that there was not much of a change really, apart from the last 2 years in Thailand. All right, I'll stop in here. Up until now, I reflected on the ecosystem, and I would like to suggest to you that if any of the audience right now is interested to look in more detail in this presentation, I'll be very happy to share it with your audience, Colin. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Ehud. While we are waiting for the question, we learned a lot today. We learned that there's even the fear of failure rate. That's interesting. And my question is, what's next? How do Thai business position ourselves in the ecosystem of technology and make the best out of what they have and what we have? So forget the past, go to the next era. How should we change?
Thank you. For that, I think we should reflect on 5 questions, looking into the future. I think the first question should be, and each one of our audience right now should ask themselves these questions. Does the board understand the implications of technology well enough to provide guidance? Think about it. How many of your directors, look at the portfolio of directors, shall we call them, how many of them understand technology well enough to instruct management, the CEO, the vice president finance, vice president IT, etc., how well do they understand the technology? That's not a very good, as we see it right now, this is not a very good question unless you ask yourself which technology we are talking about. So I like to reflect on the technologies in just a second, but here's the second question. Is the digital transformation fundamentally changing the way the industry is doing its business and the way each of our corporations doing its business? When you create value today, it should be based much on the digital technology. Here's an interesting insight based on a study that I'm now involved with that has, among other institutions, Harvard University involved. Something happened in the way board of directors operate today. We found out that most of directors, because of the COVID-19, among other things, most of directors now invest at least 20% more time when they're away from their office at the expense of family life. We found that the rank and file, the regular employees, now spend 20% less time doing the work and more time devoting to their families. Digital technology is supposed to help us become more efficient and effective as we pursue our job as directors. Not everybody understands that. Most of us use Zoom today, but we should use Zoom aided by other tools in order to make our work as directors more efficient, more effective. The third question we should ask ourselves looking into the future is, how do we measure our progress along the digital transformation line? In other words, if we insist on using now artificial intelligence, do we measure how much of an impact artificial intelligence has on our business? Do we do it so that every board meeting we can measure in the metrics, right, in the measurement, in the dashboard, how well we are doing? The last two questions we should ask ourselves, does the board have innovation talent scouting opportunities? In other words, can we find out the best person to be appointed a director that brings innovation, whether it's product innovation, process innovation, business model innovation? Do we actually have scouting opportunities? And the last question is, do we have, as board members, a clear view of those trends that we can call disruptive trends, those that may change our business forever? Before I leave this topic, Colin, I want to give you an example. Procter & Gamble, as I indicated earlier, doing consumer products, has an interesting counterpart in Israel. Dagan knows it, and Or knows it, and some of our Israeli audience, which are now listening to us, know it. OSEM is a company that was founded 100 years ago in Israel. And the founder of this company, which I knew very well, as a chairman of the board, said to the board members, every week when we have our meeting on Sunday, usually they had the Sunday morning board meeting, I'd like to have a recommendation for one new SKU, one new product in the food industry. Now think about it. To innovate in the food industry is almost impossible at the rate of one product a week. Now, mind you, a product could be a change in the chemistry, could be a change in the packaging, but it should be a new SKU. As a result of that, about 2/3 of the snack food market in Israel belong to this organization called OSEM, OSEM. When Nestle, world global Nestle food company, wanted to consider an acquisition in Israel, they right away latched on to OSEM because they were impressed with the innovation capacity of this organization. There are some more products of this kind, and some of our Israeli counterparts will recognize them. But the bottom line is, in the food industry, 2/3 of the snack food industry market belong to this organization. One product, one new product every week was the resolution by the board. Thank you.
And also, I have screening, I have reading the P&G's board of directors right now as you talk, and there are 14 of them, and there is a subcommittee. P&G has quite a few subcommittees, but one of the major one that has a lot of is P&G Innovation and Technology Committee. That has 6 members, okay? And you look at the board member of P&G, many of them are from technology like Cisco, but many of them are from companies that are deeply impacted by technology, like Delta Airlines, like Disneyland, Walt Disney, like Boeing. So what we are trying to say here is that if the board understands the implication of the technology, it doesn't have to be about P&G, but about their own. It helps a lot, right? Just my observation. Anyway, before you talk, there is a question from the floor, which is, why would you recommend an innovation unit of a corporate be attached with other units and not working independently?
Let me repeat the question. I want to make sure I understand the question. Would I recommend that the innovative unit?
Too. Yeah, why would you recommend an innovation unit of a corporate be attached with other units and not working independently? I think the question is that that innovation unit should be, according to someone, is attached to another unit, not working independently. I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. Okay.
All right.
Anyway,
let me rephrase the question, Colin. The question is whether we are going to have the innovative function or the innovation function very part of what I like to call the daily operation, or whether it should be a separate entity. I hope that's the question. Let me make sure that we understand that. Many times in the past, think back, those of you that can relate to the information technology revolution. Going back 20, 30, 40 years ago, many board of directors were accustomed to deal with IT as a separate entity. We know that IT today becomes very part of the daily life of our operation, even changes, whether it has to do with SAS, software as a service, or other functions of IT become intertwined with the daily life of the corporation. I, for one, would like to see innovation as being very part of the daily regimen of every director, every executive of the corporation. It's very similar to what I believe is, in the old days, you might remember there were some great management schemes called just in time, or TQM, Total Quality Management, just in time, SIM, etc., etc. The idea now to make each one of those developments, those particular management approaches, very part of our daily life. On the screen now, you'll see 11 disruptive technologies that I would like to recommend to each one of our audience to go back to school, so to speak, and learn about each one of these technologies. Each one of them are disruptive technologies. I won't go into each one of them, but artificial intelligence is one of them. Machine learning is obviously a more sophisticated way, using some mathematical and statistical algorithms to understand better what we observe in the way of changes in the market, changes in consumer expectations, etc. Deep learning is an even smarter approach to basically putting together a better insight as to what the trends are. I won't go into each one of them, but obviously each one of those 11 technologies, I suggest that as early as tomorrow, you'll be starting to read about each one of them, because each one of them possibly holds some kind of a key to innovate. That's not the only one, obviously, but those are technologies that I suggest each one of the directors would go back to school, quote unquote, and learn about it, see what kind of potential each one of them can have. The idea of, for example, Internet of Things is an important one. And cobots, which is basically robots sharing tasks, is important as well. So these technologies, I suggest, Colin, are very important technologies to become familiar with. Going back to your question then, or to the question from the audience is, I'd like to suggest that innovation is very, very part of our daily life. And obviously for directors, members of the board of directors, but also for the executives, and obviously for the rank and file. Thank you.
Thank you. There is some more question, Professor Ehud, if I may, which is aligned with my third question. My third question is, how would we best govern technology now? That's my question. But there are questions from the floor, which is, should we require at least 1 or 2 members of board to be technologists?
All right.
And
so,
there are some more questions, but please.
Okay, so let me reflect first on the question from the audience. The answer is very short. Yes. I suggest that there'll be suggested 1 or 2 members that I'd like to call them wearing the hat of innovation. In other words, on the agenda of the next board meeting, I suggest even before you deal with accounting, financial issues, legal issues, you just put on the agenda a general title of innovation, and let those 2 people speak, talk, reflect on what they thought about since the last meeting. This is not very natural to many boards, but eventually it becomes very part of our meeting. Don't put innovation at the very last item of the agenda, because I can assure you, most probably you will not get to this item on the agenda. I suggest you put it on the first item of the agenda, and if you want, you cut the conversation short. So the answer to this question, as I said, yes. I'd like to see in every board 1 or 2 people that are, quote unquote, for now, responsible for innovation. Later on, we can change, but for now, for sure. Then the question of governance, just to make sure, I like the idea of having a committee, an innovation committee. You have the compensation committee, you have the audit committee, investment committee. Now you have an innovation committee, and you expect this innovation committee, as I said, to be back to the board every meeting, if possible, first item of the agenda. Thank you.
Professor Ehud, many thanks for that. And I just want you to clarify, technologists mean like pure technologists, or we mean a business person who understands the implication of technology on business?
Yeah. Let's talk about the ideal board member in this context. The ideal board member is somebody that has applied innovation using some technologies in another corporation, same line of business, same sector of the economy, and with so much of experience, he comes on board. Understanding the implications, he has done it before successfully, and that's why you want it. I'll give you an example. In Boston, there's a company called Moderna, which happened to be now providing vaccines around the world with a newly created, it's a technology, but newly applied.
Everyone in Thailand knows them.
Ah, okay, all right. So you'll be surprised that the board of directors of Moderna constitute also directors that come from another sector of the economy altogether. They come from, listen to this, farming. If you think for a second, not much innovation is in farming. We still plow and then we cut and then we process and then we logistically move it to another market. But without naming names, you know, from personal knowledge, this particular farmer is so much in tune to introducing new technology in farming that Moderna decided he'll be a very valuable member of the board of directors. Now, I don't have to tell you how much Moderna stock went up over the last 6 months. I think it went up like 4 or 5 times, because the board of directors of Moderna constitutes of people that are minded towards innovation. And they were open-minded enough to take people from other businesses, other sectors of the economy, bring them on board just to have the innovation slant or bent to the board of directors. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Yes. What you're saying and using Moderna's case is that most of the directors give new perspective to technology, to Moderna. Okay. Okay. So coming back to how would you govern? How would you govern technology? How would you govern all? If you were the board, how would you make sure that the opportunity has been obtained or pursued, and at the same time PDPA risk has been addressed, and also new way of technology create new ethical dilemma every day, and something might backfire us tomorrow if we don't think carefully about our consumer. So how would you govern someone like or who runs technology or innovation?
Right. There's no question that the way to govern innovation, as it is to govern anything else, is to make sure that this becomes part of our daily routine. In other words, as opposed to the old days, if we say, that could be last year, the new routine is thought about very carefully, and I've indicated that already throughout my talk. The new routine says, scout for people that have applied technology before successfully, and try to recruit them as part of your board. And if you have a problem, legally speaking, then you can always call them an advisory board. Second, make sure that your agenda of the board of directors includes, as a matter of course, routine, an item called innovation, product innovation, process innovation, new business model innovation. Thirdly, appoint an innovation committee. On this committee, you should have, obviously, the people that you brought in to deal with innovation, but not only them. You might like to have another 1 or 2 members of the board of directors, possibly the chair itself, that would give guidance to this particular committee. Last but not least, have a metrics, some kind of a measurement scheme that the board can use in order to find out whether they make progress in a way of innovation. Now, I'm going to be very frank with you. One of my problems or challenges employing OR is how much of a budget of resources am I willing to allow or assuming that he's in charge of innovation, to spend, possibly including failures. And that's not an easy answer. We do know, though, that companies that are very well known for introducing R&D successfully, Moderna is one of them. Moderna is a case in point. Check out their financial statements. It's amazing how much money they put in R&D. Actually, it's a losing proposition when you look at the cash flow point of view. 3M, Procter & Gamble is a good example, and then some others. The idea was, at the time, for example, 3M, I had a chance to work with 3M for a while, and the challenge was there, how much of a budget you allow for new products. The rest is history, because as you know, 3M became a Harvard Business School case. Everybody studies them, you know, about the rate of innovation. But the key was allowing enough of your budget for innovation. That's also important. So if you summarize it for this session, we're looking at basically 5 things that you should maintain as part of your new innovation routine. And as so long as you stick to this routine, chances are you'll be successful along this route to innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me read that. Firstly, live that life. Create the routine that the people around you are really into it, and you will be a part of it too. Secondly, appoint an accountability, a group of people who are accountability for it. And we use the example of subcommittee, which is innovation subcommittee. And third, come up with the metrics that everyone can see and become accountable for. So this is the, so it seems to me like we as a director cannot say that technology is not my thing anymore. We all the directors have to embrace this life, not pointing to technologist director and say, it's your job. No, it's not. Because everyone in your board has to understand the implication of technology to the business, right? Okay. There are some other questions from the floor. This one is, there are many times that the board will always be concerned on investment or investment on new project, as the many are always afraid that it will not make the impact within the time and will affect the balance sheet of the company. How can we change the thinking of that?
That's a very, very good question. There's an interesting statistics about that, but I don't have it in front of you right now. But obviously, this is a great issue of what we call risk management. When you go down the innovation path, you have to, and I didn't mention it up till now, you have to be cognizant of the risk involved in your investment in innovation. And I can refer you to several sources for that, but I think it's a good idea if as part of the innovation committee of the board, you'll be able to do this risk assessment of every decision, because otherwise we're going down a path that may or may not be successful, but we don't even have a clue about the consequences. I'm talking about the financial consequences. So I suggest that you go back to school, again, if I may suggest so, on risk management, because then you can obviously come up with the different scenarios of the outcome of an innovation effort, and then come up with the possible outcomes and be able to come up with what I believe is a logical understanding of what route to follow in a way of innovation. So risk management is something you should, again, go to school. I'm suggesting you to go to school, obviously, not literally, but learning about this, become cognizant of the issues. Risk management is very part of it, yes.
Yeah, thank you. maybe I want to twist the word not going back to school, but never leave school because you learn every day.
All right. I like that.
Okay. This is the last part of your talk. The time is running out. Professor Ehud, what would be your last wisdom for the board of directors who has to see innovation the way you do, but at this time has to survive because the pandemic and the situation. Short term, we have to survive, and then we should never lose sight of the next S curve. And the management are so busy firefighting. What shall we do?
I had myself had a great professor when I was in school called Warren Bennis. Professor Bennis, who was a member of the Harvard University faculty, coined this thing called management under conditions of VUCA. VUCA. You may be familiar with the term. It has been around for a while. I remember, when he developed this particular concept, I was still a student. And I was very impressed, obviously, with this concept. I'd like to suggest that you go back to reading this. There was a book, there were several articles about the VUCA management principle, because all of us are now exposed to what I believe are the acronyms of VUCA, namely vulnerability, uncertainty, etc., etc. My feeling is a complexity and ambiguity. Those are the four terms. The idea is that we are now right there. And there are some particular approaches suggested by Professor Warren Bennis at the time under the VUCA conditions. One of the things I'd like to suggest, and it's not that because I've got already a panacea for this whole problem, all of us are facing it, but changing the way we work is something that we should consider seriously. And those changes which I believe are a result of the pandemic, for example, making sure that we are not in close proximity to each other, making sure there's social distancing, looking after hygiene, some basic stuff, I think can help us under these conditions. So I suggest, Colin, to go back to the idea of managing corporations under conditions of VUCA. And as I said, it's not a panacea, but think in simple terms, looking after the well-being of our workers, looking after basic hygiene, making sure that we have social distancing, wearing our masks, something like that I have right next to me. Basic stuff, okay? It's amazing how much we can enhance our working conditions if we just stick to some basic rules. And remember, the world has gone through some major catastrophes in the past. World wars, famine, etc., etc. And we managed to survive. Actually, every time we went back in a way of conditions for humanity, we went forward by much. I'd like to think about pandemic also as an opportunity to become more appreciative of our family, more appreciative of our employees, more appreciative of our daily life. I think that some of these principles that help us go through some disasters as humanity can help us to go through this one as well. Let me summarize this meeting today by my faith. It's a Jewish faith. We say that in order to be a good human being, you should do three things. First, you should read a good book. I suggest you do that. reflecting on this session today. Second, incidentally, you can obviously Google, and there are many sources for good ideas that we talked about today. Second is make a good friend. That's by my faith. And thirdly, take a good trip. Well, obviously, we can't take a good
How
trip
could you
now.
do that?
But up until we meet, we should still read the good books. You can obviously Google some of my books. I'm not selling it. This is not a promotion, but still my books. Some of them are sold on eBay and Amazon. You may learn from it some insights, but again, this is not a selling. This is not promotion. I'm not doing commercial now. Making a good friend. I'm really happy that Colin, I met you as the CEO of IOD. Really appreciative of that. I met some of your colleagues as well. I want to also thank Dagan, who obviously the mastermind of this whole thing. And I even learned from Or, who is a little bit younger than me, but obviously has an insight and experience worthy of studying. So thank you, Or, as well. So thank you, Colin. Appreciate your time and everybody's time.
Thank you, Professor Ehud. I would like to summarize what we heard today from both Dagan. Many thanks to Dagan for arranging this. From all P&G and from Professor Ehud. So P&G has used Israel as a hub for innovation, and the result of working between P&G and the startup has been impressive. As you can see, the number of 45 completed pilots out of 100 and more approved project, and 29% has been scaled. And that takes commitment between the business unit and the startup. And it did not happen by chance, because 15 years ago, P&G already announced that they want to grow innovation outside P&G. We call it proudly found elsewhere. So with that, even though their center is in Cincinnati, but their board of directors, 14 of them, if you Google, is amazing. And with those board of directors, it's not really technical scientists, but it's the people, the business people who understand how technology impact their own business and use that to apply as a board of directors of P&G. And then there's Ehud. And for the first time in my life, I just heard this statistic, which is the metrics of fear of failure rate. And coincidentally, it might be cyclically in line with the success of the economy at the time, which understood by is quite understandable. But what I learned from Professor Ehud is that we all have to, we as a board has to understand technology, not only the technologists or scientists. Embrace that life. Order online, use online as much as possible, because that will get you to understand the implication on you, which means that you understand the implication on customers, which means that you will eventually understand the implication on your business. So firstly, embrace it. Stay near people who understand it. The second one is subcommittee. That is a good way to start the accountability with a group of people. And thirdly, metrics. And, I assume that, and I suspect that P&G has been using metrics the way all presented years ago, years before. And that metrics right now has been proved very valid. With that, I would like to talk about our next session. This Thursday. This Thursday is the second session with the Disruptive Innovation. It starts from 2 o'clock and end at 3:30. And we will see Dagan again, and he'll be explaining. Should I spoil it now? Maybe a little bit. We will hear from 3 case studies of Israel, the startup, the business, which is from food industry, from technology, data-driven industry, and from the venture capital industry. And even how Thai entrepreneurs work with them to make the most out of the collaboration. So with that, I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank the sponsors, and I can't read the names of everyone right now because there are so many. So please, it's on the flyers. I would like to thank Dagan for arranging this wonderful virtual trip that is even better than the physical trip because we don't have to fly. And lastly, I would like to thank all the members for tuning and listening to us. And please see you again on Thursday. สวัสดีครับ
ในการบริหารธุรกิจเนี่ยมันมีปัจจัยที่จะทำให้องค์กรยั่งยืนเนี่ยที่เกี่ยวข้องเยอะมาก
เรื่องของการบริหารความเสี่ยงเรื่องของการที่เราจะต้องทำอย่างไรถึงจะดำเนินธุรกิจอย่างยั่งยืน
เรื่องของ sustainability กับเรื่องของ strategy เนี่ยมันคือเรื่องเดียวกัน
มันเป็นการเติบโตไม่ใช่เพียงแค่เศรษฐกิจแต่เป็นการสร้างสังคมที่แข็งแรงขึ้น
วันนี้ sustainability เนี่ยเป็นความท้าทายที่ให้ทั้งโอกาสนะครับแล้วก็ความเสี่ยง
คนรุ่นใหม่จำนวนมากเนี่ยเขาเริ่มมองว่าทำยังไงที่จะรอดกันยาว
ๆหลักสูตรนี้ดีมากเป็นการช่วยบอร์ดเข้ามาเป็นส่วนคิดมากในการวาง strategy
ถ้าสามารถมาร่วมในหลักสูตรแบบนี้แล้วเนี่ยผมว่าไอ้นี่คือความหวังเลย
เราได้เรียนรู้เนี่ยไม่ได้จากแค่วิทยากรเท่านั้นแต่เพื่อนๆในคลาสเองเนี่ยก็เป็นอะไรที่สุดยอดไม่น่าจะได้ไปหาเรียนได้แบบนี้ที่อื่น
รู้สึกว่าผมไม่รู้อะไรอีกตั้งเยอะในการที่จะเป็นกรรมการที่ครบถ้วนผมพบว่าทันสมัยมากขึ้นแล้วก็ตอบโจทย์หลายๆอย่าง
สิ่งแวดล้อมด้านของสังคมและก็ด้านของธรรมาภิบาลก็เป็นหัวใจสำคัญในด้านของ ESG ขณะเดียวกันก็ต้องมี Innovation เพื่อที่จะสามารถที่จะมุ่งไปข้างหน้าให้ได้อย่างมั่นคง
ทุกคุณเป็น Top Management คุณเป็น Chairman คุณเป็นกรุ๊ป CEO ต่างๆต้องมองภาพยาวธุรกิจที่เราอยู่มันอยู่ใน direction ที่มันจะไปหรือเปล่าเทรนด์ของ business มันจะไปหรือเปล่า
องค์กรจะอยู่เฉยไม่ได้ละดังนั้นเรื่องของตัว innovation นะคะหรือเรื่องของ sustain เนี่ยเป็นเรื่องที่บอร์ดกับฝ่ายจัดการควรจะต้องมาให้ความสำคัญที่ชัดเจนและเพิ่มขึ้น
ธุรกิจเนี่ยมันต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงตามสถานการณ์เพราะฉะนั้นบอร์ดที่มีความรู้ความสามารถที่จะสอดคล้องกับความต้องการธุรกิจเป็นเรื่องสำคัญ
niche player เนี่ยมันถูก disrupt มันถูก challenge มาตลอดว่า despite ว่าคุณ short term performance คุณทำดีจะแน่ใจยังครับว่าอีกหลายปีข้างหน้าคุณจะทำได้เหมือนเดิมและทำได้ดีกว่าเดิม
การมาร่วมสัมมนาเนี่ยนะฮะก็ทำให้เราได้รับรู้นะฮะแล้วก็เห็นมุมมองต่าง
ๆเราเห็นภาพกว้างเราเห็น foresight ว่าวันนี้การเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งหลายความท้าทายทั้งหลายกำลังเข้ามา